So today we're going to have a second session on the education and learning. I think we did have an online session, and this one is more about the quality of the learning. So this is Ashraf Rabat, Data Analytics Manager, UNICEF Pakistan, the chair of this session, and I'm co-chairing this session with my colleague Jay Wazidan.
Recording in progress.
We do have 3 presentations. The first one is about learning poverty. The second one is about harmonizing parental education attainment variables using the mixed data. And the third one is about the disparities, gender disparities on education. The most common thing around this presentation is the geographical area of interest, which is the sub-Saharan Africa. So I will hand over to Ray for the time being, who will be the speaker for the first presentation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this afternoon I'm going to speak to you about learning poverty and foundational reading in sub-Saharan Africa. And I would like to thank my co-author, Fatma, who unfortunately is unable to be here this afternoon, but I want to emphasize that she's a key participant in this research. How do I advance this thing?
Yeah, you should be able to click. Right, yeah.
I'm right-clicking.
Left click.
Let me show you.
Okay.
Let's come back here. So we just need to do like that.
Oh, I use the ball. Okay. The education, we're looking at the Education Sustainable Development Goal 4.1, which says that all girls and boys will complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education. And we assume that quality education implies that you'll be able to read. We're looking at learning poverty, but we're using the foundational the foundational reading module in the mixed surveys. But learning poverty is generally defined by UNESCO using the PEARLS, TIMSS, PASEC, and other international surveys. The idea is that 86% of children in sub-Saharan Africa suffer from learning poverty. There are many reasons for not being able to read. They include that you're not in school, you're behind the expected grade for age, as well as just poor learning, even though you're in the grade that you should be in. We're looking at sub-Saharan Africa, which is very multilingual. There's lots and lots of languages in almost every sub-Saharan African country. However, the education is often in the colonial language. It's often in English, French, Portuguese, the language of the formal colonial ruler. Learning poverty formally is defined as both participation and learning. And the World Bank uses the out-of-school rate of children in primary school age, and then for learning, the percent of 10-year-old children who cannot read and understand a simple story. We're using the mix foundational reading module, and so we're not using these exact definitions, but we will look at participation and learning. We're going to skip one slide. Our methodology is quantitative. We're just using descriptive statistics. The countries that we're using are Chad, Ghana, and Nigeria. We've done additional countries since then, but that's what we had ready at the time we had to submit the PPT. We're looking at children aged 7 to 14 years of age. We're looking at the outcomes for participation. We're looking at never enrolled, non-enrolled, delayed in education, and we're looking at learning, particularly the effects of the language of instruction on reading ability. Our main question is that the issue is that countries arrive at learning poverty by different routes. So what is needed in each country to have the greatest impact on reducing learning poverty? What are the issues where a particular country is falling short? When we're only going to look at some preliminary examples, we're still analyzing data on this. Okay, one of the first things we look at is simply for participation. We look at children 14 to 15 years of age, and we're looking at the proximate determinants. We can see here that Chad does reasonably poorly on everything. Ghana and Nigeria are more interesting because although Ghana has a much higher rate of ever enrollment, Nigeria does better in terms of primary completion. You can see Ghana, the blue ever enrollment is better than Nigeria's ever enrollment rate, but primary completion is somewhat higher for Nigeria than for Ghana. These are the types of issues that affect whether or not children can read. Another issue is, in terms of participation, is whether or not children have ever gone to school, the sort of reddish line, and whether they've dropped out before age 7 to 14. One thing you can notice is that those who speak at home the colonial language, for instance, French in Chad or English in Ghana and Nigeria, they do relatively well, although other language groups do well also in Nigeria. Other groups do well. But it's important that those who speak the colonial language at home are relatively few. They're mostly very small groups. In Nigeria, a fair number of people speak English at home, but in Ghana and Chad, they're very, very small groups. Again, we're looking at the language spoken at home, and whether or not children are behind the expected grade for age. So we're looking at 10-year-old children, and we would expect that they would be in 4th, 5th grade, perhaps. So what we've looked at is the proportion of children who are actually in 1st through 3rd grade amongst those who have actually entered school. And we can see again that the kids who have who speak the colonial language at home tend to do reasonably well, particularly in Nigeria, that only 20%, 21% are behind. Again, Chad is generally bad on everything. Okay. This is looking at one of the questions in the foundational learning module, and that is a question of whether or not the kids accept to read a text. And this is after they've gone through the module a little bit, so the kids know what the rules are, and then do they say that, yes, okay, we can continue and we will try to read a text. Again, Chad is an outlier in the sense that the French speakers, the ones who speak French at home, are less likely to accept to try a text. In Nigeria and Ghana, very high proportions of the kids who speak English at home are willing to try reading the text. Okay, language of instruction has, it's become a very important issue in recent years. One of the issues that people raise is, in whose language are children unable to read a text? Is it the colonial language or the home language, the language they speak at home? And one of the issues that we have with the mixed surveys is that some surveys use only the colonial language in order to assess reading. So some of the surveys only present a text in French or in English to test reading. The Nigeria survey presents 4 different languages, so offers an African language in to test the reading. UNESCO says that the home or native language is critical to improve learning outcomes, and often what is argued is that using the national language, or well, an African language, during the first years of primary school will improve learning outcomes and will improve the ability of children to learn once they switch to the colonial language. On the other hand, there are people who argue that the mother tongue won't help you eat. That is, if you don't speak a colonial language, you're not going to get a job, you're not going to earn well, you're not going to be able to show that you're educated. Okay, so Mix presents both a short text. The short text is very simple. It basically consists of 12 to 15 words. basically says that my name is something and I'm 5 years old, my name is something else and I'm 6 years old, or something of that order. What we see is that consistently those who speak the colonial language at home do better. What's interesting is that in Nigeria, those who speak Hausa at home, whose instruction, whose schooling is in Hausa, do very poorly. Now, there are people who say that that's because all of the materials, even though the teachers speak Hausa, all of the materials are in English. So they're being taught a colonial language in an African language. In Ghana and in Chad, in Ghana the texts are in English in the survey, and in Chad they're in French in the survey. Now, sometimes kids do better on reading, sometimes kids do better in terms of answering the questions, ability to answer the questions. There's a little literal question of how old is, how old is John, and there's an inferential question of, is John older or younger than Mary, that sort of thing. Sometimes the kids who speak the colonial language at home do better on both things. The longer text is what is used by mix in order to estimate foundational learning. Now, we've used different indicators. We've used the mean words correct. Mix uses whether or not the kids read 90% of the words in a long text. But we do look at 3 literal questions and 2 inferential questions. Am I done? 2 minutes. 1 minute. The key difference that we use that UNICEF does not use, Mix does not use, is we use the actual text. Only the kids who have read, who have actually tried to read the text, whereas Mix uses all of the kids who are 7 to 14 years of age. That's because we're trying to actually measure reading. We want to know, can the kids who are in school, who have actually read the text, have they been able to read the text? Not all the kids who maybe are in school or not in school, kids who are behind in grade and whatever. So we're looking only at those who actually tried to read the text. Again, kids who study in the colonial language do better. Okay, for future research, we're going to look at countries where the dominant national language is used as the language of education. We're going to look at countries where adequate samples use the local language, even if they also include the colonial language. And then we're going to do multivariate analysis. So thank you. Those are our emails.
All right, thank you so much, Ray. I'm going to move to the next presentation.
All right, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Renee Iwo. I am a PhD candidate in sociology at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the US. And today I'm presenting to you work with a lot of co-authors from different Canadian universities here. None of whom can be here, unfortunately, but they are here in spirit. So we are working on presenting a case for harmonizing parental education attainment variables in mix. And this is not to criticize mix whatsoever, but this is more to like identify a low-hanging fruit that we think mix can pursue. So first of all, a little note on terminology that we use throughout this presentation. We are insisting on using the term MFE, or Mothers and Fathers Education, because we believe that the two deserve complementary and separate consideration in analysis of children's outcomes, because even though they are sometimes highly correlated, they do have different pathways on affecting children's outcomes. But 2 points that I want to make as background. The first one is that mothers and fathers education is very important. It affects parenting style, resources, and psychosocial environment in which children grow up. And it also has crucial implications on children's lives and outcomes in both the short and long term. So here are some examples: time with children, supervision of children, nutrition, so what children eat, education, performance, and also eventual attainment, healthcare, and also eventual mortality of the children, and also in the long run timing of marriage of the children themselves. So the other point that I want to make is about family socioeconomic status in mix. So first, moving backwards a little bit, social surveys measure SES in many different ways. Here are some examples: household income or expenditures, occupational prestige, asset ownership or wealth, and parental education. However, not all of these measures are suitable for the low and middle incomes context, like the Global South context. So in contexts where household income tends to be inconsistent, poorly reported or poorly recorded, or in kind, using household income might not be the most suitable measure of socioeconomic status. Same deal in countries where most work happens to be informal, occupational prestige might not be such a good measure. So we are already quite limited. And in mix, the main indicator of family's SES happens to come from wealth score or quintiles, which is constructed from asset ownership or wealth, which we've talked about quite a lot in this conference so far, and also parental education. And comparing it a little bit with the Demographic and Health Surveys, or DHS, which is a survey, another cross-country survey that is used commonly in conjunction with mix. We see that mix does not have parental employment variable, whereas DHS does. However, I've heard whispers that in mix 7, we've started asking about parental employment, so hopefully that problem is solved now. Although I haven't heard a confirmation about that yet. But income and expenditures, which are admittedly a little bit harder to measure, those do not exist in either surveys. And mothers and fathers education reflects parents' social endowment and cultural capital, which I should note is slightly different from what is captured in wealth or wealth quintiles, right, which captures a little bit more financial capital. And both are equally important for children's lives worldwide. And this is one of the benefits of mix. One of the strong points is that it is suitable for use in cross-country, cross-national analysis, which makes it all the more important for us to have reliable cross-country measures, right? But we know, if you've done cross-country analysis using mix, that it is very, very not straightforward to collect cross-national education data, especially because education systems vary widely across countries and also within countries over time. So this is not an easy challenge, but Mix so far has done this by asking in the household questionnaire about each household member this question: what is the highest level and grade or year of school that this person has attended, right? So just showing you a couple of examples from Thailand, Mix 6 household questionnaire. It's asked in 2 parts. Have you ever attended school? And if yes, then what is the highest level and grade? And it has quite a complicated legend here at the bottom that I've copy-pasted here. And another example, Nigeria, in Mix 6, it asks it in 3 steps. Have you ever attended school or ECE, formal school or ECE? If not, then have you ever attended informal? But if yes, you've attended formal school, then you get asked the same question as before. What is the highest grade and year? And the point to be made here is that it is different per survey. The legend is even more complicated here, right? Which allows for flexibility to allow to allow for the different contexts of each country to shine through, but at the same time present some challenges for harmonization at the data analyst side of things. So MIX does provide a standardization of mothers and fathers education in 3 variables: ME for mothers, FE for fathers, and HE for household head. And it has 4 categories, as you can see here. Usually it's none or below primary, primary, secondary, and above secondary. However, sometimes there are discrepancies. In a few countries, the secondary and above secondary categories are broken down in different ways, so junior secondary and more. And in other countries, yet again, there are sometimes only 3 categories. So even with the best approach, best intentions of providing standardizations, there is still some discrepancies that can be improved upon. And now we're going to talk about a little bit of the challenges that we foresee with using cross-national education data and analysis. The first one is what we call the boundary problem, which stems from the fact that each country's education system is unique. So you can imagine that the boundary between primary school and secondary school is different in each country. In some countries, for example, here I have the example of North Macedonia versus Kyrgyzstan. In North Macedonia, primary school is only 4 years, whereas in Kyrgyzstan, it's 9 years. Now you can imagine that having 4 years of primary education is really different than having 9 years of primary education. But in the current standardization that MIX provides, and also probably if you are doing cross-country analysis, you don't have time to go super in-depth into each country, you're just going to take what's already there. And this current standardization masks this heterogeneity. And also the other point that I'd like to point out here is the number of years is 13 in Macedonia, and it's 11 in Macedonia and 13 in Kyrgyzstan. So number of years are also different, and the grade numbering is different. As you can see here, the grade numbering is continuous for North Macedonia, 5 to 9, 10 to 11, and it repeats again in secondary for Kyrgyzstan, so grades 1 to 4. So that presents some challenges in data collection. And then there's the point about the problem that we face in analysis if we do cross-country analysis. Mixed countries vary widely on how widespread education is, as you can see from this map right here. If you take a look at Europe and Central Asia, which is a region that MIX does, it's quite green, which means it's higher. The modal category is likely to be secondary and above. Whereas in some countries in West and Central Africa, it's quite yellow here. So the modal category tends to be none or below primary, or the lower category. So when you do analysis, pooling or comparing all these different countries, these standardized categories, you might have empty observations in the lower categories and only in the higher categories. For example, if you're using Europe and Central Asia, right? That creates some statistical some estimation problems. And again, there's also inconsistent treatment of vocational education. And vocational education, I'm sure all of us knows, but it's education that tries to impart skills that are directly employable, is available at various levels in many countries, often at the secondary or tertiary level. However, it's not always specified in MIX what the level is, which creates some uncertainties for us data users. And also another point is that duration of vocational education can differ from regular education at the same level. So you can imagine a vocational high school program being 1 or 2 years longer than a regular high school program. So we've looked into the literature to find several potential approaches, and we are going to talk about a few of the pros and cons. So we reviewed publications from the last 10 years from the MIX publications list on the website. And we tried to look for any cross-national studies involving children that uses any mother and father education variable. And we did full text search whenever possible. And we found a total of 26 studies using any MFE variable. And from these 26 studies, we kind of grouped them into 3 different approaches. So the approach 1 is categorical variable for levels of education, dichotomized variable of high versus low education, and also continuous variable with years of education. So we're going to talk about the first two approaches. The first approach is the most common. It has 3 to 4 categories. Some people just use whatever's already provided by mix. Some people try to create their own according to the context of what they need, if they're only comparing a few countries, for example. And it varies by what is the common denominator according to what the analyst needs. It is simple, and it mostly preserves each survey's original categorization. So they can kind of wash their hands afterwards and just say, this is what's provided, right? But it does present the problem, the same boundary problem that I talked about earlier, right? Which is still inconsistent between countries. And also the analysis problem of having empty observations in some categories, depending on which countries you are comparing. And the second approach is dichotomizing, which requires recoding into high versus low, with the cutoff determined by each country's distribution or according to what you need. And for example, if you're doing West and Central Africa, a few studies that we saw did never attended school versus educated at all. It is simple and it's very succinct. However, it does lose information and requires discretion of the analyst, right? So you might have to defend your decision. The last approach is the continuous variable of years of education, which is quite rarely used in cross-country studies using mix. And we've only found it in 1 or 2 studies, if I remember correctly, which only compare 2 or 3 or 4 countries. So it's quite involved. I'm assuming it's the reason why they didn't do it in larger studies. But it does preserve the highest amount of information about mothers and fathers' education. And since we talked about DHS earlier, I should point out that this variable is also provided in DHS. So in studies that combine mix and DHS, this is something that is a little bit of a missed opportunity for mix. It can be standardized across countries, which solves the boundary problem, and also can incorporate countries with skewed distributions in analysis. So it solves the analysis problem that I talked about earlier. And currently, it does require quite involved recoding by going into each country's individual questionnaires. So if you're using IPUMS, which has been promoted quite heavily in this conference, you gotta look at each country's questionnaires. And also, sometimes the questionnaire doesn't give you all the information. You need to look at whatever information is available online about the divisions between different levels of education in each country. So it involves quite a lot of recoding and judgment and also reporting on your side. So what we would like to propose is some harmonization from mix, and one of the most low-hanging fruit that we can see is asking vocational education in a separate question, which is something that is already done by some countries for non-formal education. So we figured that might be something else that mix can add, although as we've heard today that it takes 10 to 15 years to make any changes, so hopefully in mix 10. Conclusion, mix is a rare gem that allows cross-country analysis, and thus it is important to have SES measures that are reliable across countries. And I don't have to tell you again, mothers and fathers' education is important indicator of family SES. And mixed data currently face challenges in collecting this data that are readily usable. And there are various approaches, as we've summarized. Years of education is the one that we prefer for the reasons that I stated above. And mix, we are hoping, this is a little stronger statement than I would like it to sound, but we implore mix to facilitate the harmonization of the years of education variable for all the reasons that I said above. Thank you so much. This is my email.
Thank you so much, Renee. So we're going to move to the next presentation.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present this paper, which is co-authored with Julie von Wiegers and Rebecca Torto. Let me start motivating this paper by saying that it has been shown evidence that girls tend to outperform boys in different educational outcomes, not only in enrollment rate, but also in test scores, in particular in reading and language-related subjects. Most of this evidence have come from high-income countries, but recently there has been more evidence from less developed countries showing that girls, school-age girls, do better in these reading exams, and there has been mixed evidence in math-related subjects. As I mentioned before, most of this evidence come from school-age children, and therefore, in our paper, we're asking the question whether we can trace back this gender gap in early childhood, given that during these early years is where fundamental cognitive skills are established. Given the limited evidence on gender gaps during early childhood, especially in low-income countries, our paper aims to contribute and with answering this question. And so what this paper does is to estimate the gender gap in early literacy and numeracy skills among 3-4 years old in 25 sub-Saharan African countries using mixed DHS. Our main results shows that girls do better than boys. In particular, they are approximately 2 percentage points more likely to identify at least 10 letters of the alphabet and the first 10 numbers. We also look at what could be the potential factors or contributors to this result, and we find that early childhood, attendance to early childhood education program, it's the most important one. And also girls are more likely to receive home stimulation from the parents. And finally, we find some intergenerational effects in which mothers for their kids' early skills, but in particular have a larger influence on their daughters' early literacy skills. And so the data we use, it's from mix. We use round 5 and 6 of 23 countries that correspond to the years 2013 to 2019. We also use demographic and health survey, rounds 6 and 7 of 8 countries corresponding to 2011 to 2017. Our main outcomes comes from the question that asks the mothers to report whether their 3-4 years old children is able to identify at least the letters of the alphabet, read 4 basic words, and identify the numbers. And so here I'm showing basic summary statistics. We have a sample, our sample of boys and girls. And just to mention it briefly, here in terms of our main variables, in our sample, we have that around 17% of the children can identify 10 letters of the alphabet. Almost 13% of the children of our sample can read 4 basic words, and almost 18% of the children can identify the first 10 numbers. In addition, we use mother and household characteristics, which at least they are very similar across our 2 samples between boys and girls, with a slight difference in the case of the likelihood of fathers being absent in the household, and also the pure status of the household. In addition, what we use in our analysis, it's early childhood education. First, we think about early childhood education outside home, in which around 20% of the children in our sample attends an early childhood education program. In addition, we focus on some activities before at home that we call home stimulation activities performed by at least one of the parents. We focus, mixed and dishes include these 6 activities, in which the most popular one is take the child outside home, following by singing songs to the children. We have that almost 65% of the children in our sample have received at least one home stimulation activities from the parents. And they have participated in an average of less than 2 of these activities. And so, how we estimate this gender gap? To estimate the gender gap, we regress the female indicator on the set of outcomes. The outcomes are binary indicators that take in the value 1 if the child can perform a particular skill. Literacy, numeracy skill, as I mentioned before, we have 3: identify 10 letters of the alphabet, read 4 basic words, identify 10 numbers. So we ran our OLS regression, in which we include controls, the children's age, we include also mother's age, mother's education, measured as mothers having at least secondary education. We include family size, whether the father is absent from the household, whether the household is poor, and also where the household lives, urban or rural area. In addition, we include country and survey year fixed effect. The standard errors are clustered at the country level. And so what are our results? We find that girls do better than boys in these early literacy and numeracy skills. In particular, girls are 1.6 percentage points more likely than boys to identify at least the letters of the alphabet, and similar estimate for identifying the numbers. We also find that girls are 0.5 percentage point more likely to read 4 basic words. However, this estimate is less precise. We also do some heterogeneity analysis by country, showing that at least 70% of the countries in our sample show a point estimate that favors girls in these basic skills, and showing some heterogeneity that for some countries these point estimates can be as large as or very close to 8%. Then we focus on what could be the factors behind these results. Here we ran a similar regression as before, but in this case the outcome are early childhood educational program attendance, ECE, and also we ran the regression on home stimulation activities. What we find here is that girls are 1.1 percentage points more likely than boys to attend an early childhood education program, but also they are 0.6 percentage points to receive at least one home stimulation activity from parents. We find that girls in general are more likely to receive these different activities, except for taking the child outside home, in which boys seem to have an advantage, even though this estimate is less precise. We look closer about these home stimulation activities, and here what we focus on is home stimulation activities primarily carried out by mothers and primarily carried out by fathers. We exclude in this graph the cases in which the child received these activities from both the parents. And therefore, we can see here some same-sex bias. That is, girls tend to be engaged more in these home stimulation activities when the mothers are the primary caregivers that are performing these activities, while boys tend to engage more with their in these activities when their fathers are the ones that participate. Finally, we do some heterogeneity of the gender gap. We try to look here what are the importance of the different potential contributors of the gender gap. And we find that early childhood education are the one that seems the most important. In this particular case, early childhood education, attendance to early childhood education program increases an additional 2.5 percentage points the gap in favor of girls. And also, we find here that literate mothers also have a differential effects in favor of their daughters. And this is particularly relevant for the case of identifying 10 letters of the alphabet. And so far, what we have found is that this wider gap among children are coming from the ones who attend early childhood education program and has a literary mother. Also, something that we caught our attention is that given the literature about the importance of fathers absent of the household, and given that in our sample 25% of the fathers are absent from the household, that doesn't seem to have an impact of the gender gap. And finally, in order to look at to see another evidence of how early childhood educational program is important, what we do is to split in two groups the countries. One country of low early childhood educational program attendance, and another group of countries with high early childhood educational attendance. And what we find is that in countries where there is low attendance in these early educational programs, the gender gap almost disappears. But this gender gap in favor of girls is stronger in countries where there is a high rate for early childhood educational program attendance. And so, in conclusion, we find that girls, 3-4 years old girls are doing better than boys in these basic or early literacy and numeracy skills. In particular, they have an advantage of approximately 2 percentage points. Even though these numbers might seem small, it's important compared to the base that only 20% of the children have these skills. And finally, we highlight that the early childhood educational program attendance and the mother's literacy are important contributors to this gender gap favoring girls. And so with that, I conclude my presentation. Let me...
Thank you so much, Irene. Thank you so much, Irene.
Okay.
So we do have less than 10 minutes for Q&A, all right? So we do have 2 questions. Please mention the presentation or make reference to the presentation.
Rennie, my question is to you. Just checking, UNESCO has the kind of, I looked it up because I always forget the acronym, ISCED classification. So they kind of compare loads of different countries' education systems. And there is and you see them sometimes in publications showing up like, you know, ISCED level 1, and then they kind of mean the same thing across countries, even if they're sometimes named primary school or secondary school. So I find them sometimes quite useful because they're meant for international comparisons, so it might be worth having a check. I mean, this still doesn't solve the issue. I'm not sure if you have it. Yeah, go ahead. Because I didn't want to put you on the spot again, but you might have it.
Hi, this is Anna from IPUMS, and Renee, my question is going to be for you too, and I think IPUMS can really help with this years of education harmonization. The ISCED codes are not consistently applied to the summary variables that were in Renee's presentation about the mother's education and father's education. IPMS did an initiative to attempt to recode the summary variables that are provided by MIX into ISCID, and it's also quite a heavy lift. So that's also something that is definitely the future of like something that IPMS could be doing to better utilize and harmonize, because that is a more consistent classification that I think users who are using the summary variables provided by MIX in a harmonized way are perhaps assuming that primary is primary per ISCID, and it's not, from what we found. And so, yeah, that I'm hearing ways that IPMS can step up in this regard. So.
So my first question is for the presenter. Thank you very much. Just really very keen to understand why you decided to focus on children more than 7 years of age, given that schooling, I mean, at least for Nigeria, most children would be in school by 2-3 years. The educational system could accommodate that. Then my second question is for Renee. I completely agree with you on the need for harmonizing education variables, having attempted to do that myself. Then my question would be, you suggested that vocational training should be taken out of education variable. But I'm just thinking, you know, we're not just interested in education, but we're interested in the impact of education. And I don't know, just in my head, trying to compare vocational training with secondary school qualification versus just having junior secondary, and what that translates to in terms of earnings, or even the knowledge and skill that a person has. So I don't know if you've thought about the limitations, or whether this is even a problem, or the challenges of including or excluding vocational training from the education variables in mix.
Thank you so much. Let's start by Ray, then I will. Please, Ray, if you want to come in here. We want to see you on the camera.
Why 7 years of age? Because that's what the module dictates. It's 7 to 14 years.
Yeah. So you need the microphone just because.
Come again. Yes, come again.
Okay. The module says who's able to read between 7 and 14 years of age. That's what the module dictates.
Thank you. Renee, please.
Yeah, thank you for the suggestion about ISCID. That was something that we were aware of, but we haven't really taken a look at. So should have done that maybe before, but glad to see that IPMS have tried to start doing that. Maybe we should collaborate on something? Yeah, yeah. And to your question about taking out the question about vocational education, we didn't mean take it out of the survey, but taking it out into a separate question. So ultimately, the same amount of information is collected, but in a way that would be more easily parsable than before. Because you are right that it is important to see the difference between vocational education and non-vocational education in some contexts, depending on what your research question is. We're not proposing on deleting the question, we're proposing to separate the question so that it is more clearly collected. Because also what you get a lot of the time is some countries don't even have that option to collect data on vocational high school, where I'm sure there is a vocational high school, secondary education option available there, right? So asking it separately might mean more standardization in a good way. Yeah.
Thank you, Renee. Is it a question for Renee? So I can ask him to stay there. Okay.
No, I think, Renee, it is really interesting. But my question is, I think even if we do the years of schooling, there will be challenges because, the entry age for school also differs by country, right? That is one. Second is, most of these variables are customized for country purpose and use, not necessarily for the use of international, means country by country comparison at times, though UAS tried to do that, and I know IPMS are also trying, but it is difficult. So most of the time, these variables are created for the country needs and how the education is structured at country level. So that is why they are different. Okay. And secondly, even if we have the same kind of things, education systems, we cannot say that they are all of same standard. Okay. So country standards also vary. So they are not necessarily that way also comparable. So when we are trying to compare these kind of variables across countries, I think we have to be a little bit careful. That's what I just want to caution. Okay, when we, as data analysis, people looking to compare things, we want things to be in the same manner, but that may be sometimes dangerous also. So we have to be careful, and how we are going to interpret all those aspects needs to be also looked at. Not merely having the same categories just for the sake of having the same. Yeah, just want to add that. Thank you.
I guess you don't want to say anything.
I can say something, but it's just agreeing with what you said, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say thank you for the consideration. Thank you for the extra consideration about mix being kind of like country-oriented rather than specifically for international comparisons, unlike the DHS perhaps, which is more focused on getting like survey of everything. Yeah, but but you are right that it does invite some dangerous assumptions. But perhaps like with there are statistical tools that we can use to like make sure that we address it, right? Like fixed effects, for example, or stuff like that, to make sure that these assumptions are still taking into account the difference in quality between different countries in education. On the point about years of the years of starting education, that is something that we have not thought about. So that was actually a really good point. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much. So with that, we'd like to thank the presenters again, and we're going to close the session.